Hello, hello everyone. Right, I don't know if we have people yet, so I'll be waiting for a few more seconds. For some people to join us for this very last lesson of the year. Eventually, the year will be completed to some point. So I don't know if I've got some people here, right? I'll be waiting just a bit. Hello, I've got some people. It's a pleasure having you. Hello. Right, I'll be waiting for let's say 1 minute before we really start, okay? And I can introduce this lesson. Hello, people coming and joining. Right, we might not be that numerous today, but it's fine. Sorry, as usual, I'm just preparing my control room on the phone. Okay, good. Right, so for people behind the screen, thank you for waking up early and being here. Sorry for this. This lesson, hello. Right, in front of your eyes, you've got the structure and the plan for the last lesson of the year. As I've told you, it's a mix. It's a mix of actually three different lessons in the program, and these lessons are supposed to complete and the history study of the modern times, okay, the century after the Middle Ages. As you know, you may know this, next year in Première, you will start by studying the French Revolution. And I won't teach it in French. That will be my colleague's presentation. I will deal more with the post-revolutionary period in Europe. But to understand the French Revolution, we need to focus on how situation was in Europe just before. And the official syllabus is telling us to focus on, hello, good morning, for people arriving. We are asked to tell you about 3 forms of political power in Europe before the French Revolution and starting in the 17th century. These 3 forms are the British form of monarchy, which is perfect for us in the OIB because it belongs to the Cambridge demands too. So studying the British model of monarchy. What did it mean to be a monarch, to be a king or queen in England between the 17th and 18th century? The second model we need to study is the American model. Why was a new state created in the 18th century? And why did the American colonies declare independence? And they declared independence also by creating a new system of government, which was a democratic republic. Okay, and so we have to study the Republican model in the United States, the original American model. When I say original, I mean the one which was set up in 1776 and with the Constitution. And we'll see that France was affected by the American Revolution and that it had some long-lasting impact on France. And finally, the last lesson, and possibly the one, I don't know, maybe that's the one we won't have much time to study, I have to admit. Et comme vous pouvez le voir, je repasse en français juste pour ça, comme vous pouvez le voir, si nous faisons cette étude, elle sera en français puisqu'on ne va pas étudier l'absolutisme français en anglais, donc éventuellement. Je ne vais pas vous mentir, j'ai quand même comme un doute sur le fait que nous puissions arriver au bout. Je sais que les cours sont censés s'arrêter le 4 juillet, mais voilà, on a des convocations de bac, etc., des formations, et puis je pense qu'à un moment, voilà, l'année va se terminer. Donc, ce qu'on va quand même essayer de faire, c'est vous présenter entre cette semaine et la semaine prochaine, parce qu'officiellement, vraiment, on est en cours cette semaine et la semaine prochaine, voilà, mais vous présenter les fondements de la monarchie britannique et de la Révolution américaine, notamment parce qu'on en aura besoin pour l'an prochain en première. Donc tout ce qu'on aura fait cette année sera déjà un petit peu vu. Et si on n'a pas le temps de faire la Révolution française, enfin les prémices de la Révolution française, c'est-à-dire la période avant, je demanderai à mon collègue l'an prochain de faire un petit point en début d'année pour vous donner les éléments essentiels. D'accord? Okay? So, today, as you've seen, today and tomorrow, we're going to study the British model. Okay, so British model this week and the American model possibly next week, next Wednesday. It's a quite interesting thing and challenging thing to study the British monarchy because actually it's very contrasted with the French one. As you know, in France, we had a revolution that removed the king to install a republican system in 1792. The French Revolution had an effect on diminishing the role of monarchy. In the UK, there was a revolution in 1649, we're going to study it, when they removed the king, installed a republic, and then restored monarchy, because they considered that the republic was a bad system and a system that put the United Kingdom in danger. And so their revolution was more about installing a control over the monarchy than getting rid of the monarchy. Okay? To understand all this, so that's the first part, the one we're going to study today and tomorrow. My aim in this lesson is to explain you why there is still a monarchy in the UK today. Because contrarily to France, monarchy in the UK has adapted with small steps, slightly adapted to a system called parliamentarianism, where the parliament, which is today called the House of Commons and the House of Lords, where the parliament is the center of political life. And this parliament has a very long history in the UK. Parliament has been very important since approximately the 13th century. And that's going to be my first part, a reminder of how royal power in England has a long history of being limited. Then we'll see that in the 17th century, there was an attempt in the UK by kings, and especially a king called James James Stuart I, to install absolute monarchy, a monarchy without control. And actually, this absolute monarchy was rejected by the British nobles. And there were two revolutions, okay? One which abolished monarchy and the other one that forced monarchy to adopt a parliamentary system called the Glorious Revolution. And so this is for today. And tomorrow we'll see that this British model actually influenced a lot of people in Europe, especially the philosophers. Someone like Montesquieu, for example, in France, was inspired by this British model. And they say maybe that could be a good model, okay, for Europe. to maintain a king, but to make sure the king doesn't have an absolute power. Okay? As you know, today the United Kingdom still is a monarchy, and it's still a parliamentary monarchy, right? It means that you still can have some elements of this history in the current system in the UK, right? Okay, good. So, the nobles and the parliament. To answer your question, who are they? The people that decided to restore monarchy. This was the parliament, because we're discussing who the parliament was. So elected members of the parliament, because there were elections in the UK, not democracy, right? Not a universal suffrage or whatever, but the members of parliament at that time were elected, and they were elected by approximately 20% of the British population. So I'm going to explain all this, but your question is quite relevant. Okay, maybe before we start, we should have a look at a map of Europe at the period under study. This is Europe. At the turning point of the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay? So it's approximately, as you can see, in 1700. Actually, in this lesson, we'll be discussing much about the 17th and 18th centuries. So, at that time, as you can see, Europe was mostly about monarchy and royal systems. Okay? Whether you look at Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Austria, the Habsburg, okay? Or you look at Southern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, you had the Ottoman Empire, which is a monarchy, right? You had the Crown of Castile in Spain, so a Spanish monarchy in Portugal, right? Where did you have republics? Actually, you had some republics in Italy, right? But small ones. And of course, you had two major monarchies in France, okay, and in England and Ireland, because Ireland had been colonized by England. So let's make things clear. The period under study is a time when monarchy was not discussed, or it was discussed marginally. The question in Europe, and the question about what that philosophers and people interested in politics and people interested in studying power, the only question was more about how limited, how controlled should the power of the kings and queens be. Okay? The question was not really about should kings have power. That was not much discussed. The question which was under discussion was more how limited should the power of the kings be. Okay? And we see the British answer to this question, the American answer to this question. But remember, in the very beginning, Americans were just Europeans living on the other sides of the Atlantic. This is what you call Americans at that time. And we study the French answer to this question of how limited should the king's power be. Okay? Right? Good. So, part number one. The British monarchy towards parliamentarianism. Well, it's not a very easy word. So parliament, the adjective is parliamentary, and the noun is parliamentarianism. What is parliamentarianism? it's when the center of power in a country belongs to the parliament, to an assembly of representatives. I'm going to explain all this right later on. So, to start with, a brief reminder is that in the United Kingdom, there is a long history of royal power being limited. Or to say it otherwise, in the United Kingdom, there is a political tradition of the king not having all powers, or having his powers controlled by a parliament, by a place where people, generally noble people from the nobility, people from the lords, if you prefer, you can say it more easily, the lords, would control the king. When did it go back to? It goes back. I'm sorry for this mistake. It goes back to 1215. In 1215, a major text appeared in the British law. And it's called the Great Charter, or Magna Carta. Okay, here we are. So, just before I start, that's it. There is something I should tell you before we start. Something which is very important to understand. It's about the United Kingdom today. And it's an expression you may have already heard of. Okay, it's called the common law. Very briefly. This is the basis of the British judicial system today. And this is the basis of the British political system today. In France, we have something called a constitution, and this has been changed several times in history. And we also have a system of codes, like the civil code, the penal code, the family code, the labor code, code civil, code pénal, code de la famille, code du travail. What is this? It's a series of laws, okay, and they're all compiled in one book, or two books, or three books. It means that when you have a problem with the law in France, there is a specific place where you can find it, like, for example, you go to the Code Civil and you find an answer. If you have any a question about the way the political system works in France, you go to la Constitution de la 5e République. In the UK, it's a bit different. The common law is not one text. It's not like one book that would gather all the laws and gather all the explanation about the political system. The common law is a piling up of all the laws from the past and the traditions from the past. What does that mean? It means that today in England, you still have laws and regulations and principles dating back to the Middle Ages. Okay? And among the laws and regulations that still exist in the United Kingdom today, you have some dating back to the Magna Carta. Because every time there is a new system, every time there is a new political regime, every time there is a new, there are changes in the law in the UK, you don't change everything. It's more, you maintain most of the system. And that's a legacy from the past. Okay? Whereas in France, we tend to, how can I say this? Maybe not modernize, that's not the right word. We tend to clean regularly the law. Okay? Why am I telling you all this? Why am I telling you all this? Because it has two consequences. Firstly, the judicial system in the UK and then in all the countries inspired by the UK, like Australia or Canada or America, the USA, have this principle of common law too. Secondly, and that's the second reason, because this text, which we're going to study, called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, still has some validity in the English system today. Okay? I've mentioned three clauses, three extracts from this 1215 Magna Carta, which still exist in the British law today. Okay? So, what is the Magna Carta? Very briefly. If you remember, when we studied the Crusades, when we studied how the British King Richard Lionheart, Richard Cœur de Lion, he went to the Crusades. Okay? While he was at the Crusades, power in England belonged to John. When Richard, after Richard reigned, John, the one we know as Jean Santerre in France, John Lackland, he took power, but he lost many wars. And the lords in England were very worried that the king was a bad king. They were worried that John was the bad king. And they forced him, that's all you need to remember so far. They forced him, John, to sign this text. And this text is a text that limited the power of the king. The king was forced to sign a text, the Great Charter, that limited his own power and gave more power to the nobles and more power to the cities. Let me show you how this text limited the power of the British king. So every time you read "we" in the text, we, like in the first place, we have granted to God, that's the king, King John. He had to sign this. In the first place, we have granted to God, and by this our present charter confirmed for us and our heirs forever, that the English church should be free. So the king should not control the church. And they should have their rights entire and their liberties inviolate. this text, the Magna Carta, protected the liberty of the church. So first limitation for the king, liberty of the church. Number 13. The city of London shall have all its ancient liberties and free customs. Okay? Furthermore, we decree and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports shall have all their liberties and free customs. What does that mean? The king cannot collect taxes from the cities. He can collect taxes from individuals, but not from the cities. And the cities are free to collect their own taxes. So, this is why you've got a place still today called the City of London. Why is it called the City of London? Because that was a part of London where the city and the city council could collect its own taxes without the agreement of the king. So that was a way to limit the power of the king in collecting taxes. Also, no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or deceased or exiled or in any way destroyed. Nor will we go upon him nor send upon him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. What does that mean? The king is not allowed to arrest someone and send someone to prison without a proper judgment. Okay? The king is not allowed to say, oh, I don't like this guy, grab him and put him to jail. And look at the date. That was in the 13th century. So it means that the king didn't have all the power. He couldn't force the church to do something. He couldn't force the cities to do something they didn't want, especially in terms of taxes. And he couldn't arrest a man just for his own pleasure. If he arrested someone, this person had to be judged properly, with a proper judgment. Okay? Also, all the fines, a fine? A fine is money. Money you have to pay. A fine is a financial punishment. If you drive too fast on the highway, you will pay a fine. Okay? During the lockdown, if you went out or if you went onto the street without your proper, paper, administrative paper, you would be fined. That's a fine. All fines made with us unjustly and against the law shall be entirely remitted. So if it was proven that the king had condemned someone to a fine which was unjust, the king had to pay it back. Okay? So that means I've got one last article to read you. What does that mean? All you have to remember, it's just a reminder, okay, of something I've already mentioned very fastly, but it means, and if you want to take notes, this is what you should note. Since 1215, there is a text in England called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. There is a text which has limited the power of the kings. Okay? Another way to put it would be to say that there is a tradition in the UK of an institution controlling the king. And this institution is called the Parliament. Look at the very last article. So just in case you hesitate, what was the parliament in the beginning? What was the parliament in the beginning? The parliament was an assembly of lords, of nobles. Okay? Sorry, I'm just reducing the size so you can read more easily. Yeah, perfect. In the beginning, the parliament is an assembly of nobles and lords. Okay, it's not elected, like you don't have people voting for the parliament. Okay, who were these nobles and lords? The answer will come from the last paragraph. Just one last point. Why is it say parliament? Because if you remember, at that time in England, people spoke French because they were from Norman ascendancy. So what is the parliament? It's the place where you speak. Le parlement. That's where people exchange and they speak. That's it. Okay? So look at this. Number 61. Line 3. We give and grant. To grant means we give and we affirm we give something. We swear we will give something for sure. Okay. We give and grant to them the underwritten security, namely the barons will choose 25 barons, 5 and 20, they will choose 25 barons. What is a barons? A baron is a high lord. It's a high lord. Okay? And the role of these barons is to observe and to hold the peace and liberties we have granted and confirmed to them by this our present charter. So, what is it? 25 nobles would be chosen by the other nobles. So it's not really an election, it's more choosing them, more discussing and who should represent us. And these 25 barons, they would be here to make sure the king would respect his commitment. So the Magna Carta is an official charter which can be summed up this way. Firstly, the King of England, said he would respect liberties, and not freedom, liberties of the church to be the church, liberties of the cities to be cities, liberties of people to be judged if they were free men. Okay, that's it. Secondly, the king was forced to do that. It was not a choice. Like, the king did not wake up one morning and say, oh, let's give liberties to people. He was forced to do this. And why was he forced? Because he was a weak king. He was a king that had lost many wars. He had lost his territories in Normandy and so on. Thirdly, a new institution was created, which would become the parliament, a place where people, nobles in the beginning, would be able to control the king's decision. And if you look at the date, that was as early as the 13th century. So that's my summary for part 1. royal power in England had been limited by a parliament, since the 13th century. And secondly, you still have traces of the Magna Carta today in the British law. Oh, I should have shown you this because for example, in the Magna Carta, it's not in this text, but in the Magna Carta, the clause 29 says, repeats and states that no one should be, every free man should have a right trial, should have a fair trial. This clause is still in the British system today, which is normal, right? But it's written in the same way as it was in the 13th century. There is still a right to due trial in England today, and that's a legacy from this text. Okay? Is that clear? Do you have questions on this? If you have some, please do not hesitate to type them in the chat. That's the British tradition of monarchy. Take care. It doesn't mean the British monarchy was a democracy, right? It's not democratic at all. People did not vote. What you have to understand is that the power of the king was limited from an early time. Okay? So why did it change? Well, why were there problems about this in the 17th century? Now we go back to we move on to the 17th century. Okay? And we move on because we have a new king. So that's the second part. There is a word I've forgotten. It should be the rejection of absolutism in England. Sorry for this. There is a missing word. So we're moving on to the second part. And we're not going to study the full system. We don't have the time for this. But we need to study two moments in the British history. One is 1749 and the other one is 1788-89. And in these two moments, in these two episodes, there was a resistance by the parliament to absolutism. Okay? It means that the parliament was strong enough, to reject several attempts by the kings of England, several trials by the king of England to have more absolute power. Because at that time in France, and that's going to be the last part of the lesson, in France, for example, the king was an absolute monarch. And the kings of England, some of the kings of England and queens of England were looking for this form of power. But in England, it did not work. In the UK, in the United Kingdom, it did not work. And this is what we're going to study right now. So 1649, 1688, the rejection of absolutism in England. Sorry for the missing word. I'm just looking at your questions and answering them right now. So, what is a due trial? So that's for Paul Tregor. I'm answering your question. A due trial means that you are innocent until proven guilty. You're innocent until proven guilty. That's exactly it. This is exactly what a due trial is. A due trial is innocent until proven guilty. So that's absolutely it. Actually, it was not said exactly like this in the Magna Carta, right? Due trial means there should be a meeting between, an official meeting where people will be judged and assessed fairly. The notion of innocent proven until proven guilty appeared later. I have to admit, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly when. Okay, I will look for this for tomorrow, but I don't know precisely when this notion appeared. Okay. Second question: the transition when they became a constitutional monarchy was easier. Firstly, I'm not sure you could actually call the British system a constitutional monarchy because it's the common law. You would rather call it a parliamentary monarchy. There is no proper constitution in the United Kingdom. You have constitutional text, okay, which form a constitution, but a constitutional monarchy would be more something like what happened in France in the 19th century. What you have is a parliamentary monarchy, and Mary, I'm going to tell you, no, it was not that easy. And I'm going to prove you that it was not that easy, because there was a moment when, kings are not always weak. There were moments when the kings were stronger, and when the kings were stronger, they tried to, influence the system in their favor. And this is exactly what I'm going to tell you right now. So, that's it. There is a law, the Salmon Act, that said that you can't hold a salmon suspiciously. Well, that's a real one. That's wonderful. Actually, if we had time, there are magnificent, there are brilliant laws in the British system, because the common law is a law which develops more and more when it meets new problems. And so every time a problem is met which has no solution, there is a judgment on it, even in the most extraordinary situations. So this would explain why you've got a Solomon law or Solomon jurisprudence. Right. Can we move on? So thanks for your questions. Can we move on with the second part? And we're going to talk about a king called James. So James has got two names, or not two names, but James is known as okay, sorry, I have to insert my image. I've got half an hour left, so I'm trying to accelerate a bit. Okay, sorry, it's coming. Just okay. Right. There is, alas, something that we really don't have the time to study this year. We should have had the time, but as you know, we were a bit like disorganized by the events and the lockdown. I have not taught the lesson regarding the religious reformation in Europe, when Protestantism and the Reformed Church appear in Europe. But as you may know, it had strong consequences over the United Kingdom, because there was a fight between Catholicism and Protestantism. Okay, eventually, the Protestant religion became the official religion of the kings and queens. But there was a moment when you had Catholic kings in England, and these Catholic kings, like the Stuarts, like James, so he's called James the Sixth or James the First because before he was king of Scotland, the Stuart was the royal family in Scotland. So he was James the Sixth of Scotland, and then he became James I in England. And these James, this King James, okay, was a promoter, he was a proponent of being an absolute monarch. And that was due partly to the fact he was a Catholic king. Why? Actually, James Stuart and James I is also well known for writing a lot. Okay, he wrote a lot of text and books, and he was interested in the biblical text. So he was rather good and well taught in biblical in studying the Bible. Okay, and so in 1610, he went in front of the Parliament. So remember, the Parliament is a place where nobles, mostly nobles, would control the king and especially would establish the law. I won't go further. I will explain you further on. And as you can see, James I, as you will see, he said it is not the role of the Parliament to do that. Why? I'm reading the text. The state of monarchy, remember, monarchy means one man ruling, one person. Mono, arcane, okay, one person ruling. The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they are called gods. So it's very clear. Even by God himself, the kings are called gods. And clearly, you're not going to upset the power of God. There be three principal similitudes that illustrates the state of monarchy. One taken out of the Word of God and the two other out of the grounds of policy and philosophy. And remember what I've told you? King James studied the Bible. He is very famous for publishing a specific translation of the Bible, which is called King James Bible, which is still used in England today. It's one version of the translation of the Bible which is still used. It's called King James Version. In the scriptures mean the Christian Bible, the Christian holy text. Kings are called gods. And so their power after a certain relation compared to the divine power. Kings are also compared to fathers of families, for a king is truly parens patria, the father of the people. The father, this is why you call your country the motherland or fatherland, right? Depending, but the fatherland is your country. It's the same in German, right? Vaterland. And in French we say la patrie. What is la patrie or fatherland? It's where a family of people live. Who's the father? The king. And lastly, kings are compared to the head of this microcosm of the body of man. Microcosm means a small world. A microcosm is a small world. And the body is a small world. And the head is the most important organ. In the body, the king is the head. So, can I summarize? What is James' conception of power? I have to accelerate a bit, sorry for this. But what is James' conception of power? It's very clear. The king is not only sitting on God's throne, he does not only have God's approval. That's something we have studied together. He does not only have God's approval. He is, to some extent, a God himself. He is of, look at this, line 7. Line 7 is of divine power. And as you may know, in France, the expression is monarchie absolue de droit divin. This is what, for example, Louis XIV had, right? Monarchie absolue de droit divin. Divine power. And so, of course, if you are of divine power, it becomes less legitimate to challenge you. It becomes less legitimate to control you. It becomes less legitimate to limit your powers as a king. Who would control God? So who would control a king? Okay? And you see, this may be due, it's not the only reason, but this is due to the fact that James was in the tradition of Catholic kings. And Catholic kings pretended that they held their power from God. Okay? So, if we keep on, kings are justly called gods. Okay, so it's true. We can be called gods as kings, he said. For that they exercise a manner or resemblance of divine power upon earth. For if you will consider the attributes to God, you shall see how they agree in the person of a king. Look at this. God has power to create. Okay? God has power to destroy. God has power to make or unmake at his pleasure. God gives life or sends death. God judges all and cannot be judged. He be judged nor accountable to none. You can't judge God. And God can give you life and takes life from you. Okay? And the like power have kings. If kings are like gods, then all the power that the gods have, the kings have. I don't know if you see the point here. I summarize. King James knows the Bible very well. In the Bible, he says, kings are called gods. So kings are like gods. Step number 1. Step number 2, what can gods do? They create life, they take life. They destroy, they make. In the Bible, gods can destroy cities, for example. God can judge. Remember, at the end of life, there is the final judgment, the doomsday, the day when everybody will go to be judged by God and they will either go to heaven or hell. But no one can judge God. So, logical conclusion, if gods can do all this and kings are gods, then kings can give life, take life. They can judge, but not be judged. They can, look at this, if you look at the center of the text, the like power of kings, they make and unmake their subjects. They have power of raising and casting down. They have power of life and of death. Judges over all their subjects and yet accountable to none but God. The only person to which kings have to pay counts, to be accountable, to justify, is God. Not a parliament. Not a parliament. Because a parliament is only humans. It's now it has become a kind of cliche, but only God can judge me. And, the king may have this tattooed over his belly or arm, only God can judge me. That's exactly, it's a cliche today, but that was exactly what James was defending. Okay? Right? But, so what's the consequence? To the king is due both the affection of the soul and the service of the body of his subjects. There is no word like citizens here. Subjects. The king has subjects. And he talks about a pawn, like in the chessboard, okay? Just subjects are just pawns. You play with them. Okay? Right. Mary, that's exactly the point of what we're discussing. This argument is valuable only in a society that does not challenge God as a concept. Why were they... so we'll see in the UK it's a specific story, but in France, one reason why absolute monarchy was challenged is because God's legitimacy was challenged. The philosophers from the Enlightenment period, les Lumières, they question the validity of God. If they did not question the existence of God, and some did question the existence of God. Okay? But if you consider that there is a concept of God which can be challenged, then of course God's approval and the kings being gods can be challenged. The French Revolution and the capacity to say that there is no such thing as absolute monarchy can only be challenged if you question, if you wonder how valid God is. If you don't challenge, if you don't question, if you don't put in doubt, if you don't doubt in the concept of God, you cannot challenge absolute monarchy. Before challenging absolute monarchy, you need to discuss the concept of God, and that's exactly what the French philosopher did. Yeah, sure, Jose. Of course. In most your question and remark is very good. In most countries in Europe, that was the situation. In France at the time, that was the situation. Okay? In the Habsburg monarchy, that was the situation. King was absolute. Monarch was absolute. So what James was trying to do was just to say, hey, I should do that too. Okay? And you know what? It failed. Why did it fail? It failed because in England, there was a resistance to this. And the resistance can be seen here. Actually, sorry, I'm just adding some text for you. So, I've told you that in England, at that time, you had the Stuart family. Okay? You had the Stuart family. And two kings ruled. James the First, okay, the one we've read a text about, and his successor, Charles the First. Charles came to power, I'm just checking because that's the date I wanted to check, I'm sorry. It's 1642, sorry, I had not written it down. Charles became king in 1642. And both kings took decisions. Both kings took decisions without asking the parliament to accept them. They decided not to take the parliament into account. They decided not to listen to the parliament. Okay? The parliament at that time was a strong institution. Why? Because you had all the major nobles, all the major lords of England who were in and Wales who were in the parliament. And these people, they had military men at their service. So I'm sure you can guess what happened. As the two kings, James and Charles, were opposing the parliament, were refusing the parliament to use their prerogatives, to use their rights, okay? Then the parliament rebelled. But it was not just words of rebellion. The nobles decided to resist the king. And resisting the king meant taking arms against the king. And this is how the UK, this is how England moved or shifted to civil war. The next step in England was a civil war which lasted from 1642 to 1649. Sorry, I'm just writing the date in case you need them. So, there was a civil war in 1642, from 1642 to 1649. And what was the war about? It was a war between the supporters of Charles and supporters of the Stuart family and the supporters of an absolute monarchy versus against those who defended the parliament, those who defended the right of the parliament. Okay? This civil war led to the defeat of Charles. Charles and his supporters were defeated. And that led to Charles, the king, okay, being arrested, judged, okay. This is a very famous image of the judgment, the trial of Charles the First. The parliament had the king arrested, trialed, and more than this, sentenced to death. Sentenced to death. Beheaded. Charles was beheaded. Okay, one century and a half before Louis XVI, a king was beheaded in Europe, and that was okay. This is This is the verb. Okay, when you cut someone's head, to behead. So, why did that happen? It happened because actually the parliament in England was seen as the place where the interests of the kingdom were best preserved. Why? Because when one person takes a decision, okay, the risk exists that this person alone can take bad decisions. In that case, if a person takes bad decisions, how is that compatible with this person being of royal and God's authority? If you are, can you imagine this? If you're a king and you make mistakes, but you say that you are like a god, it means that God can do mistakes? And that's not possible. That's not possible. I mean, God can't fail. Well, if God could fail, he would not be God. Whatever God it is, right? I mean, whatever deity you think of. God can't fail. That's the very definition of a God. I mean, if you fail, you're like a human. Humans fail. Gods don't. So if a king can be a bad king, there are two possibilities. Either he's just a bad king, or God is bad, and so God can't be bad. So you have to accept the fact that kings are not gods. And so the interest of the kingdom would be best preserved by having a place where the power of kings is controlled, and that's the parliament. Okay? So this, okay, just 5 more minutes. The Civil War in England had a strong impact over political philosophy in Europe. Because clearly the Civil War in England was seen as a moment, when two problems were discussed. Firstly, absolute monarchy versus parliament's power. Secondly, this civil war came during a period of trouble in Europe. Because if you remember, and if you know this, the religious wars had run for almost 1.5 centuries at that moment. It had been more than 1 century of permanent wars due to religious trouble and so on. And so philosophers starting wondering, what is the best regime? What is the best political system to preserve peace, law, and order? As Donald Trump would say, law and order. But that was a very important question in Europe at that time. Everywhere actually, but in Europe. How do you preserve stability? How do you preserve civil concord? How do you preserve peace among people from the same nation? And one philosopher, I'm giving you his name because you may meet him in your philosophy study later in Terminal, and for those who study HLP next year, you may hear of him. His name is Thomas Hobbes. Okay, here we are. Oh, it's coming. I've got an extract to it. It's the last thing I would like to tell you today, so I'm just concluding on this. Where is that? Here we go. Okay. Okay. Look at the date. Look at the date when this book was published. It's one of the most famous philosophy book and philosophy philosophical work in history, in the history of philosophy, of political philosophy. Okay, so if you're interested in politics and philosophy, this is a classic, definitely. It's called Leviathan, and the Leviathan is a monster. It's a sea monster. It's a huge monster living below the sea. What you have on the left-hand side is the original cover and frontispiece of the book. So when the book was published, it was published with this illustration. And what is the Leviathan according to Thomas Hobbes? The state. The state is like a monster, and you will see why. Let's read this, and I will explain you as a conclusion. Maybe we're just reading this today, and maybe I will give more explanation tomorrow. Thomas Hobbes said there is one thing which is absolutely to be avoided. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe is, when you're stuck, they are in that condition which is called war, and such war as if of every man against every man. Okay? In French, la guerre de tous contre tous. This is what happens when there is no strong state, or when there is a civil war. And if you look at the date, the book was published in 1651. This was just after the British Civil War, the English Civil War. So, the worst condition for men, for society, is when there is a civil war. The war of every man against every man. In such a condition, there is no place for industry, for activity, for economic activity. Consequently, no culture of the earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no building, no instruments of moving, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no art, no letters, no society, which is worst of all, continual. That's the British former spelling. That's why it's not a typo from me. This is how it was written in English at that time. Continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The worst for societies is civil war, when everybody fights everybody, when every man is at war with all other men. La guerre de tous contre tous. That's the way it was translated in French, if you read Leviathan in French, right? So, why am I telling you this? Because Thomas Hobbes would have a large influence in philosophy in Europe, and many philosophers from Les Lumières, from the Enlightenment period, were readers of Thomas Hobbes. And so they used this reflection to see what would be the best system to avoid this. Okay? The best system is to have a strong state. But a strong state doesn't mean absolute monarchy necessarily. But, and this is what Leviathan is. Look at this. Leviathan is this monster coming from the sea and, having all the weapons. And if you look at this, you can see it, containing all the nation. I don't know if you see this on the sovereign. This Leviathan has a crown, and this sovereign has got all the nation inside. The question is, should it be absolute monarchy or should it be a parliamentary monarchy? And this is what we're going to discuss tomorrow. Okay? Right? It's a bit complicated maybe, but I'm sure you can just think this over. So tomorrow, just one point of a practical point. Tomorrow I will meet some of you, the second sis, some of you in the morning. It's from 8:30 to 11:30. Then I will go back home, and certainly you will do. So it means that I will start this class at 2, not 1:30, because it's too short a span for me to go back home and prepare something. So tomorrow we have a class from 2 to 3, and I will conclude about the British model. Okay? So see you here on YouTube at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Okay? And for the second sis that I'll be so happy to meet tomorrow morning physically in the class, it's 8:30 with Monsieur Dere. And we'll be talking about political philosophy too, actually, tomorrow morning. Okay? Right. Thank you for coming to this class. It was a pleasure, as it's always a pleasure. So see you tomorrow. Okay? See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. for the YouTube session. Okay? That's fine? Bye-bye. See you.